Hi, I'm Father Joseph Mary, and welcome back to A Simple Word, where we reflect on the gospel for the coming Sunday. This Sunday's gospel from Matthew picks up directly from where we left off in last Sunday's gospel. It's a continuation of the Christian ethic, in which Jesus takes the common understanding of the Mosaic law and he injects it with a radical new point of view. Many people get confused by the seeming variance of God's character in the Old Testament in contrast with Jesus in the New Testament. You may have heard these contrast yourself, the angry God of the Old Testament and the gentle Jesus of the New Testament, or something like that. Why do so many people get thrown off by this seeming juxtaposition? We have to remember the state of human nature after the fall from grace. Human nature was deeply wounded by original sin. The intellect, which was originally oriented towards truth, is suddenly thrown into darkness and confusion. The will, which was oriented towards goodness, was warped and broken and susceptible to the most egregious of temptations. And death and corruption poison the existential reality of the human condition. And this has to be in the forefront of our minds as we reflect on the action of God in relation to man. Man's in utter darkness. And how bad was it? Genesis 6 says that when God looked on the humanity he created, he saw how great was their wickedness and that their every desire was nothing but evil. And God grieved in his heart, regretting that he had made man. Fallen humanity is in a state of corruption and rebellion, blinded and warped by the wound of sin. Why didn't Jesus come directly after the fall? Why didn't Jesus come prior to the flood? Why didn't the incarnation happen during the time of Abraham? What was God waiting for? Scripture says that when the fullness of time had come, God sent his Son. What's this fullness of time? Any of you who have very young children know that you can't reason with them. Your little 2-year-old loves getting shiny forks out of the drawer and seems so intent on sticking them into those interesting little holes of the electric socket. Now you could sit him down and you could say, "Look, little Johnny, you can't do that, because metal is an excellent conduit for electricity, and those little holes will send 120 volts coursing through your little body." You could talk to your blue in the face, but little Johnny's just going to pick his nose and he's still not going to know why he can't do his experiment. So finally you have to say, "Johnny, no, this is bad." Maybe you even have to slap his little hand. And little Johnny may wail and cry, but what you're doing is an act of love, because you're trying to keep him safe. You're trying to protect him. Those hard words and that gentle slap that he perceives as harsh and unintelligible, they're meant to keep him safe because you love him. Something analogous is happening with fallen human nature. They're not simply unprepared for the teaching of Jesus Christ, but they're in such a state of darkness that the demands of Jesus would have been totally unintelligible to them. And so God begins in a very simple way with commands and punishments. He's dealing with rebellious spiritual children. And it's going to take centuries and centuries to prepare a people who are ready for the radical demands of love. This is the divine pedagogy. This is why the action of God can seem so different in the Old Testament in contrast with the New. But think of how your parents spoke to you when you were 3 or 4 years old versus how they speak to you today. I imagine and I hope it's radically different. But it wasn't your parents who changed. It was you who changed. You grew up. You matured. In the same way, it's not God nor the demands of love that change. It's humanity that's being changed through the history of Revelation. It's humanity that's being prepared to receive the demands of love in the fullness of time. In Sunday's Gospel, Jesus begins by saying, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." Jesus is quoting the most ancient law known to man, the lex talionis, the law of tit for tat. This law dates back at least 4 millennia to the Code of Hammurabi. It's the law of exacting justice and righteous vengeance. But Jesus takes this bedrock of ancient legalism and he replaces it with 3 demands on the Christian. When someone strikes you on your right cheek, turn the other as well. If anyone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, hand over your cloak as well. Should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go for 2 miles. Jesus is placing a radical new demand on the understanding of the law. Like today, most people in the ancient world were right-handed. So to slap a man in front of you on the right cheek required you to backhand him. And the rabbinical law considered this an act of humiliation. Jesus is saying, even if someone should insult and humiliate you, don't retaliate. Don't meet evil with evil. If someone wants to go to law with you over your tunic, Jesus says, give him your cloak as well. Even the poorest of Jews had multiple tunics. They were the long inner garment made of cotton. But a man's greatest possession was his cloak, an outer garment of thick material which was worn as a robe by day and used as a blanket at night. It shielded a man from the sun and the elements and was his means of safety and sleep by night. A man had only one cloak. The law stated that a tunic could be given as a pledge, but a man's cloak could never be demanded of him. And yet Jesus is saying, if someone wants to go to court to take your tunic, give him your cloak as well. He's telling us not to stand on our rights and our privileges. Cling to nothing on this earth. Call nothing your own, but trust in the Father. That's all you need. Finally, Jesus says, should anyone press you into service for 1 mile, go for 2 miles. In an occupied region like Palestine, Jewish people could be compelled to carry the baggage of Roman citizens. And Jesus tells his disciples, even if this demand is hateful or unreasonable, don't do it grudgingly and with resentment. Accept it as a service and go beyond what's asked of you. Again and again, Jesus is taking old concepts and common understandings of the law, and he's replacing them and deepening them with seemingly radical demands on the Christian. How could any Christian live up to these demands? Because the Christian life should be characterized by a radical kind of love. And if anything Jesus had said was shocking to his audience, nothing prepared them for his next words. You shall love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The Greek word Jesus uses for love here is agape, the highest of loves for the Greek. It was a conscious decision, a choice, a sacrifice even, for the good of the other. Jesus isn't saying you should like your enemies. You should have affection for those who persecute you. He isn't saying you should be best buddies with the man who insults you. He's not saying we should set up play dates with the family that's suing us. He's not asking us to invite the man who has taken advantage of our kindness over for a barbecue. He's not asking us to respond with any kind of human affection or to seek emotional satisfaction. Instead, he's placing before us the radical demands of Christian love, a love that he's going to embody himself on the cross. As you're listening to this, maybe you're feeling a bit hopeless. How can anybody live like this? How can anybody love like this? And you're right. Humanly speaking, it's impossible. But nothing's impossible with God. Time spent with God in prayer, the encounter with God in the sacraments, it changes us. And the more intimately we come to know Christ in prayer, the more intimately we come to know the love of God for us in our life, we'll be imbued with the heart of Christ. We can't love like this on our own. But we can do all things through Christ who strengthens us. This is the witness the world needs to see now more than ever. And this is the challenge Jesus is issuing to each of us who calls himself a disciple. And Father Joseph Mary, thanks for listening to A Simple Word. If you found this reflection helpful, please be sure to like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.